Ever find yourself looking at something complicated, like, I don't know, a really elaborate watch, or maybe even lines of computer code, and you just wonder, how did anyone even dream this up? Well, get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into a system that's definitely complicated and unfortunately not nearly as precise as a well-made watch India's caste system.
And to help us untangle it all, we've got a real pro in social systems with us. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's definitely a topic that's both fascinating and, well, really important to get a handle on.
Couldn't agree more. And our guide for this deep dive, none other than B.R. Ambedkar's 1917 paper, Castes in India. Now, I know what you might be thinking, 1917. Is that thing even still relevant today? But trust me, Ambedkar wasn't just some armchair analyst. He lived and breathed the system, challenged it head on, and honestly, his insights are still shockingly relevant today, even over a century later.
So let's kick things off right at the beginning. When we say caste, what are we actually even talking about here? Because even the experts have had a tough time nailing down a perfect definition.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, often misused or like oversimplified. But for me, the heart of it, the thing that really makes caste stand out is endogamy. And that basically means marriage is a no-go outside your specific social group.
Okay, so endogamy is like the rule book. But how did that rule book even become a thing in India in the first place?
Ah, that is the million-dollar question. And to even start unpacking it, we got to rewind a bit, go back to ancient India, which might surprise you. See, back then, the norm was actually the complete opposite exogamy. Marrying outside your group was the thing to do. So this whole shift to a system like the caste system, with its strict marry within your group rules, well, that marks a huge change in how their society worked.
Wow, that is mind-blowing. It's like their whole social structure flipped itself on its head. What could even cause that kind of dramatic shift?
And that, my friend, is exactly what we're going to dig into. Ambedkar, he argues that you got to look at the how and the why behind this. Change the mechanisms that made it happen. It wasn't just some random, oh, hey, let's do things differently now kind of deal. There were very specific practices that helped cement this whole endogamy thing.
Okay, so we've got this base layer of endogamy, these strict rules about who's off limits for marriage, but how does a system like that actually spread and become so deeply ingrained in a whole society?
Quadrant. Well, Ambedkar points to a few key mechanisms that really help solidify this whole endogamy thing, make it stick, even in a society that was used to, marrying outside their group. Three customs in particular played a big part: sati, enforced widowhood, and child marriage.
Okay, whoa, those are some heavy hitters right there. And I gotta say, I bet some of our listeners might not be familiar with all of them. Could you give us a quick rundown of what those even mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So, sati, in its most common understanding, basically meant that a widow was, well, expected, sometimes even forced, to join her husband on his funeral pyre.
Wow.
Yeah, it's intense. Then there's enforced widowhood, which pretty much what it sounds like. If a woman's husband died, she was forbidden from remarrying. And child marriage, well, that involved marrying off girls super young, often long before they even hit puberty.
Man, those customs sound brutal, especially knowing that ancient India was actually more open to things like remarriage before all this. It's hard to imagine how practices like that could become not just accepted, but like deeply ingrained in a whole society.
It's wild, right? But here's the thing. Ambedkar, he argues that these customs, as harsh as they were actually meant to address a very practical problem, at least if your goal is to keep this rigid system of endogamy going. See, they helped maintain a balance of, shall we say, eligible men and women within each caste.
It's like a weird kind of numbers game then.
Bingo. Think about it. You've got your caste, right? They're all about endogamy, super strict. Now, if a woman becomes a widow, suddenly she's a surplus, right? If she were to remarry, but to someone outside the caste, well, that pokes a hole right through that endogamous wall they've built.
And I'm guessing the same logic applies to the widowers, the extra men in this system.
You got it. Though it's important to note, Ambedkar points this out too, men often had a bit more wiggle room in this whole patriarchal setup. But the main idea was the same. You control the flow of marriage, make sure it stays within those caste boundaries no matter what.
So basically, they're playing this high-stakes game of keep those caste walls up, whatever it takes. Man, it really makes you think about how much these structures restricted people's choices, you know?
No doubt about it, and it's a good point to sit with for a second. Because while we can geek out on the mechanics of caste all day, the human cost, the impact on actual people's lives, that's something we can't ever forget.
You're absolutely right. But even with all these practices in place, it still doesn't totally explain how the whole caste system, with all its little details and layers, spread through an entire society, right? It's not like everyone just woke up one day and decided, hey, let's make marriage super restrictive.
Exactly. And that's where another piece of this puzzle comes in. Imitation.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. Tell me more about this imitation factor, because honestly, it's kind of hard to imagine why anyone would sign up for such a rigid way of life, you know?
Well, think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how some behaviors, even if they seem quite illogical at first, can just catch on? They become like the thing to do, especially if it starts with people who are already in a position of power or influence.
Ah, so you're saying it's kind of like a status symbol, but on a way bigger scale?
Exactly. Ambedkar, he saw this pattern. The Brahmins, who were at the top of this whole hierarchy that was emerging, they set the standard, you know, and other groups wanting that same status, that same social clout, they started copying them, hoping to climb the social ladder.
It's almost comical when you think about it. Everyone trying to out-Brahmin each other with even stricter rules and more complicated rituals, all in the name of social climbing. It's like a historical version of keeping up with the Joneses, but with, like, way higher stakes.
That's a perfect way to put it. And it wasn't just about copying the rituals either. It was about adopting that whole endogamy thing, the whole system. And as each group adopted these practices, they in turn became the new model for others to follow. And on it went.
So we've got these customs propping up endogamy from the inside, and then this imitation factor driving its spread throughout society. Wild. But Ambedkar also talks about another element that seems kind of counterintuitive, at least at first glance, excommunication. Now, how does kicking people out actually lead to the creation of more castes?
Right. It's brilliant. It's like when a group builds those walls so high, anyone who dares to question the rules, well, they risk getting thrown out, exiled, which basically just creates a whole new group.
So it's like instead of breaking the system by rejecting someone, they actually just accidentally make it stronger. That's kind of like tragic and ingenious at the same time, you know?
Yeah. Exactly. Think about it. This group gets kicked out, exiled from their caste. So then what? Where do they go? Who's going to take them in? Chances are, not many folks.
Yeah.
So they're kind of stuck, right? Often, their only option is to form their own group with their own rules and boundaries. It's this crazy loop where even the people fighting against the system can end up making it stronger without even realizing it.
Wow, so it's like this self-perpetuating cycle. You've got these customs holding those internal boundaries tight. You've got people mimicking to climb that social ladder. And then excommunication, which actually just leads to even more pieces breaking off from society. It really makes you realize how deep this thing goes, how ingrained it became over time.
And that's one of the most crucial points Ambedkar makes. Really, it's not enough to look at the caste system as it is now.
Yeah.
If you want to truly wrap your head around it, you got to look at how it came to be, those historical forces, the social gears that allowed it to not only develop, but actually thrive for centuries.
Totally. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. Ambedkar, he dedicated his life to tearing down this caste system. And his analysis, it's brilliant, but it also begs the question, what comes next? If something is a social construct, can we actually break it down? Can we unconstruct it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And while there's no easy answer, I think Ambedkar's work gives us a starting point. He makes us confront these deep-rooted historical and social factors that are in play here. We can't just, wish away a system this ingrained. It's going to take understanding, real effort, and change at every level to even begin to dismantle these kinds of hierarchies.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that if you want to change something, really change it, you got to understand how it came to be in the first place.
100%.
Yeah.
And even though Ambedkar was looking specifically at the caste system in India, his work, it's got implications for understanding social structures and inequalities everywhere.
Absolutely. It gets you thinking, doesn't it? What can we learn from this specific system, and apply to other areas where social hierarchies rear their ugly heads and create those divisions between people?
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today, folks, from ancient India to the ins and outs of endogamy, and even those surprising side effects of imitation and excommunication.
It's a complex topic for sure, but man, is it ever vital to understand. And Ambedkar's work, it gives us such valuable insight into how the system works, where it came from, and it gives us a framework, a way of thinking about social change that's still so relevant. And for those of you out there who, like us, are eager to learn more, I can't recommend enough diving into Ambedkar's writing yourselves. His 1917 paper, it's just the tip of the iceberg, really. He goes even deeper into these ideas in his other work, so keep those brains working, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep the conversation going. Until next time, folks.